Good evening, everyone. I'm Kiki Jameson, president of the Fund for New Jersey. On behalf of the fund and our co-sponsor partners, thank you for joining us tonight for the second installment of Imagine More, Racial Justice Begins With Us. Imagine More is a first of its kind 6-part series of events that brings together national thought leaders, philanthropic and community-based organizations, academic institutions, policy advocates, jurists, and local activists from across the ideological spectrum, united around a common purpose: advancing racial justice and repairing the harmful impacts of systemic racism. Over the course of this series, you will hear from change makers who will offer action plans for making concrete changes in criminal justice, housing, education, health, and political power. While each session will focus on a different topic, we recognize that all of the topics are interconnected. This is why our speakers will also propose solutions to repair the harm created by all of these injustices and their intersections. Additionally, following each event, you will receive resources and information to connect you with the organizations doing this important work and to guide you in leading change in your own communities. We launched Imagine More last month with a focus on eliminating New Jersey's staggering racial wealth gap and ending poverty. We are enormously proud that nearly 650 people registered for the kickoff, demonstrating that not only do they understand the urgent need to address racial injustice, but that they also want to help. Tonight, we are challenging New Jersey to deliver on justice for all. So welcome to our second event, Disrupting the Criminal Justice System. We are delighted to present Amal Sinha, Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of New Jersey, better known to many of us as the ACLU, which has been leading the way on reimagining our criminal justice system in New Jersey, or as Amal describes it, the criminal legal system. Amal will help us to understand how the system works now, whose interest it serves, and what we can do to change the current system and to repair the harms of structural racism that infuse it. Amal will then be joined by Professor Kristen Henning, Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law, and the author of The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth, and by Nafisa Goldsmith, Senior Criminal Legal Fellow at Salvation and Social Justice. Lawrence S. Lusberg, Larry, a trustee of the Fund for New Jersey, will moderate an interactive discussion with tonight's speakers and will include questions from you, the audience. And now, here is Amal Sinha. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Kiki, and good evening, everyone. First of all, let me just give a big thank you to all of our sponsors, and in particular, the Fund for New Jersey, which has been a leader and a thought partner on these crucial conversations and making sure that the advocacy space is robust. I'd like to start by zooming out a little bit. Look, we often talk about the criminal legal system like it's one massive entity that we're all subject to. Thinking about it in that way makes it seem like it's impossible to improve. But the reality is that the criminal legal system includes many players, each of whom have their own challenges and needs and biases. They impact us from childhood to adulthood, conditioning us to tolerate a police response to routine situation. The police are, for most of us, the entry point into the system. And increasingly in Black and Brown communities across the United States and here in New Jersey, we see heavier police presence, including police in schools using criminal responses to everyday childhood behaviors. Then there are prosecutors who decide who should be charged with crimes and make recommendations on how they should be sentenced. There are courts and judges who make sentencing decisions. There are legislators who create criminal justice policy and sentencing guidelines. And there are corrections officers and prison officials who manage the conditions in which people are imprisoned every day here in New Jersey. And then there are parole boards who decide when somebody can be released from prison And there's so much more along the way. It's a sequence, it's a chronology, and it invades so much of our lives. The truth is that the work of reforming the system is the work of reforming each individual piece of it. It's a lot of work, but we at the ACLU of New Jersey and our partners, many of whom are here on this panel tonight, are working on it. And we need you to support these efforts so that we can begin to repair the harms of the deliberate injustice that has persisted in our society. And I say deliberate. It's not by accident that Black adults are 12 times more likely to be incarcerated than white folks in New Jersey. It's not by accident that Black children are more than 30 times more likely to be incarcerated than white children in New Jersey. It's not by accident that Black people are 3 times more likely to have force used against them by police. And it's not by accident that Asian, Hispanic, and Black drivers face more tickets for traffic violations, even though white drivers are pulled over more frequently for those same infractions. It's all pieces of a system designed to oppress and harm. Sunday was the 2-year anniversary of the murder of Breonna Taylor. And we're approaching the 2-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, which we all witnessed on video. And just last month in Bridgewater, New Jersey, we saw racial bias and the criminalization of Black youth in action during a scuffle between 2 teenagers at a local mall, one who appeared to be white and the other Black. And police swiftly tackled and arrested the Black child while comforting the lighter-skinned child who they sat on a sofa. These are all symptoms. They're all harms. And how do we repair the harm? We need to reimagine policing wholesale, and we need to repair the harms that policing has inflicted on our communities. We must stop by over-investing in law enforcement and start investing in real, life-affirming responses. In most instances, people don't need armed police to resolve issues, and we have to rid ourselves of our reliance on police. What they need is a school counselor, a therapist. They may need a mediator, or simply they might need a tow truck. And we need accountability when bad things happen. Over the past 2 years, bills in our state legislature to add some degree of accountability in policing have simply languished. These bills, which would allow for civilian oversight of the police, increase transparency in policing, ban chokeholds in policing, and end qualified immunity, they've all stalled. And in fact, New Jersey has taken steps backwards by giving more power to police. We must do better. So there are specific policies that we can embrace that can help us repair some of the harms. We must look at these solutions through a racial justice and reparative lens. And when we think about reparations, we often think about where and how we spend our resources. So we can start in the context of policing by scrutinizing police budgets and treating them as we do any other dollar spent in government, by diverting resources from criminal justice responses and investing them into community-based responses. When we think about reparations, we can also think about systems and supports. We can rid our schools of police officers who look at every minor infraction through a criminal lens and start investing in counselors and the care that children actually need. And when we think about reparations, we can think about community empowerment. We can pass a package of bills that would help hold police accountable. One bill in particular that's crucial is to give the public access to police disciplinary history. We need to know what misconduct our police officers engage in and how they're disciplined. Otherwise, policing is completely shrouded in secrecy, and the public is left without power because they have no insight into the people that are meant to protect and serve. More than half of the country, from conservative Florida to liberal New York, allows for disclosure of disciplinary history, but not New Jersey. So there are many things that we need to do to hold police accountable, to improve the criminal legal system, to promote transparency, and to repair the relationships with our communities. Our lawmakers and everyone in power need to hear from you. This panel that I'm grateful to be a part of will delve into some of the most pressing issues that we're facing as a society, including the deliberate oppression and criminalization of Black Americans throughout their lives, and solutions that we can embrace today. It's my pleasure to be here and to contribute to this conversation. And I'll now turn it back over to Kiki Jamison, President of the Fund for New Jersey. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amol, for those important and clarifying remarks. Now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Larry Lustberg, trustee of the Fund for New Jersey. Larry co-chairs the Gibbons Commercial and Criminal Litigation Group, leading the criminal defense practice, and he is a longtime director of the firm's John J. Gibbons Fellowship in Public Interest and Constitutional Law, which litigates historic, cutting-edge civil rights and civil liberties cases. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, and welcome, Larry.
Thank you so much, Kiki. It's my tremendous pleasure to be here with all of you this evening to continue the Imagine More Racial Justice Begins With Us series. It's an incredibly important discussion, and tonight's has to do with disrupting the criminal justice system in New Jersey, a system that deserves disruption because it is so very flawed. Hopefully tonight's panel will shed some light on what the problems are, what the solutions to those might be, and what we can do to repair some of the damage that has been done by that flawed system in the past. Without further ado, let's meet our extraordinary panelists for tonight's session. You've already met my friend Amol Sinha, the Executive Director of the ACLU of New Jersey, a true hero here in New Jersey. Amol is also an adjunct professor at Marymount Manhattan College, where he's taught courses on constitutional law, civil rights, media law, and criminal justice. He's the past president of the South Asian Bar Association of New York and co-chair of the Public Interest Committee of the South Asian Bar Association of North America. You've already know how lucky we are to have him, and thank you, Amol, for being here tonight and providing the critical state policy and advocacy context to this discussion. Also with us is our new friend, Chris Henning. Chris is the Bloom Professor of Law, as you heard, and director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law, where she supervises law students and represents youths accused of delinquency in DC Superior Court. She's also a hero because she was a public defender, as I was, which is the greatest thing of all to be. Chris writes extensively, and I would urge you to look at her publications about race, adolescence, and policing. Kiki mentioned early on her 2021 book called The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. It's an amazing book that not only talks about policing, but juvenile justice, two passions of all of ours. And she does an amazing job of tying those two things together. So I would commend it to you. Finally, and definitely not least, we welcome Nafisa Goldsmith, who is Senior Criminal Legal Fellow with Salvation and Social Justice, and the chair of New Jersey Prison Justice Watch. Nafisa is a well-known, longtime community organizer and activist to those of us who know her here in New Jersey, who consistently speaks out against a number of injustices, including isolated confinement in prison, something which she knows about personally. She's an amazing advocate and a powerful speaker, and we're so pleased that she's here tonight. So welcome all. I'm so honored to be with each of you. Let me start with this question for each one of you. During Amol's introduction and Kiki's introductory remarks, we learned that Black, Brown, and immigrant New Jerseyans face unequal treatment at literally every step of our state's criminal justice system, from policing to prosecution to sentencing to conditions of confinement, incarceration, and to re-entry and reintegrating into community. I would ask each of you, what's the one single issue that you think those who are listening to us tonight should focus on, that you think contributes the most to this unequal treatment? And then we'll a little bit later talk about solutions. So Amol, let's start with you, even though people are probably tired of hearing from you. You can keep going.
Thanks, Larry. Thank you for that question. It's so hard to think about one thing that folks should focus on. And I'm gonna, take the advantage of being first and say, people should think about racism, right? Like it exists, and we should not shy away from calling it out. We should talk about white supremacy every single day. We should talk about how it plagues every single institution in American society. And perhaps some of the most stark data is available on the criminal legal system, but it is something that's apparent in every American institution, and something that we need to address head on. So often we hear about anti-racist behavior, right? These days we hear about anti-racist things. However, it shouldn't be easier for us to name things anti-racist than it is to call out racism, and that's something that I hope our colleagues on the panel and also our audience can think about day in and day out, as it's essential to addressing the harms.
Chris, what would you say is the single issue? I mean, you're involved in several issues, as I mentioned. What would you say is the single issue that you think our audience should be thinking about and focusing on as they consider tonight's presentation?
So I want to leave everyone who is listening with the premise that America's obsession with policing and incarcerating Black and Brown America starts with the policing of Black and Brown children. Right? So we have to talk about the extraordinary over-reliance on police to basically regulate, intervene, redirect the lives of teenagers, of children, right? And especially Black and Brown children. And so what does that look like? It looks like what Amol talked about earlier, the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors. I think whenever we start a conversation about the incarceration, detention, and prosecution of children, people assume that we are talking about serious violent offenses. But the research, the data, the reality is that the vast majority of children who are in courts today are there for normal behaviors that so many of us on this meeting engaged in. Boys fighting in a mall, like Amol said, at the Bridgewater Mall, adolescent aggressive speech, which is basically kids talking back to adults, property offenses, drugs, things of that nature, which we don't need traditional law enforcement responses to intervene in. And the other thing that it looks like, this over-reliance of police on police, it looks like police in schools. That's exactly what it looks like. It looks like children getting arrested for being emotional and sensation seekers and risk takers, for doing the things that kids do, and also for being getting arrested for engaging in what kids do in schools. And so I would say for me, that's where we have to start. We have to start with the kids.
Thank you. It's awesome. Nafisa, why don't you tell us what you think, coming from your perspective, the single issue that people should focus on during tonight's presentation should be?
I would say erasing the white patriarchal mindset that we all have come to subscribe to. And that goes into believing all things that society puts out about specifically people of color. Have to unveil ourselves and to be able to look at what's really there. And so what that is that there are blinders, and we have to be able to say that this is not what America should look like. This is not what our state should look like. The highest racial disparities here in the state of New Jersey in our prisons. This is very real. Racism is extremely real. And until we can just say it for what it is and not feel in any way, ashamed, that this is something that still exists in our system, I think we have to just look at white supremacy and say enough is enough and stop buying into it.
So let me follow up, Nafisa, to that statement by saying, what's your view from where you sit of what the long-term intergenerational effects of the kind of over-criminalization of New Jersey's Black, Brown, and immigrant communities is? What are the long-term effects for this society in which we live, from your perspective?
It's frightening. It's frightening because if we continue this, like I said, wearing the blinders to this Black and brown manhunt that's going on, it would almost be as if, people of color are extinct in this state. You're throwing away our youth if there are no youth, and if there are no credible youth, or youth who could be what we would like to say as, productive citizens who do not have any kind of blemishes on their criminal record. I think that would be very far, few and in between. And so it would be extremely sad, but also it would be indicative of, once again, a system that has never allowed Black and brown people in it. And we know that when we use those words like re-entry, that we've subscribed to, once again, those societal constructs to make us think that we are reforming a system that has so many cracks in it. Why would you want to use those same materials to reform it? Why would we want to adopt a language and belief systems and behaviors that subscribe to this system? So I would really just say that it would be a very sad state of affairs if we continued on hunting Black and brown bodies.
So Chris, you write a lot about children, and I suspect that you have strong feelings about what the intergenerational effect is as those children grow up, and where some of the conduct comes from. I mean, what's your view of the intergenerational effects of the kind of racism that Nafisa and Amal have so compellingly discussed tonight?
Yeah, this is such an incredibly important conversation. I got to tell you, Larry, there is a growing body of research documenting the extraordinary psychological trauma that policing and criminalization imposes on Black and brown children at one of the most important stages of their development, those adolescent years. Studies show that Black and brown children who live in heavily surveilled, heavily policed communities, and who are the frequent targets of stops and frisks, report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. They become hypervigilant, meaning that they're always on guard, not trusting police officers. And here's what's important: that distrust of police officers transfers over to other adult figures, right? Many of whom might be allies for them. What is so incredibly powerful about that research, Larry, is that it shows that this trauma occurs even without being the direct target of the police contact. Just hearing about it from friends and family, or witnessing it in your community, is enough, right? So getting up in the morning and having to worry about being the victim of some sort of police violence, for example, and as Amol mentioned, watching the killing of George Floyd on television, right? And I say to folks all the time, imagine what it must be like to be a Black or brown child who can say, that could happen to me next, right? And so there's this body of research about the impacts of watching these events on the internet and on television, and how young people in their adolescent years are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is what's really important also: it has an extraordinary impact on an adolescent's self-esteem, their sense of who they are, who they can become, how they engage with the rest of society. And it has an impact on their understanding and perceptions of the fairness of law and law enforcement. Right? So young people begin to question whether or not it makes sense to even participate in mainstream society. So this gets at, Nafisha's point about the making, the fact that young people of color may become extinct. It's certainly extinct as, no longer willing to engage and participate in our society because the traumatic effects are so extreme.
I'm going to move on to talk about some of the solutions to the what we've been discussing. Amol, in your opening remarks, you laid out some possible solutions, and some of those go to issues like reparations. I wonder if you could, just for the audience that may not be so familiar with some of the technical legal stuff, one of your concerns was qualified immunity, and you proposed getting rid of qualified immunity as a solution to some of the problems. Could you explain to people what that is and why you think that would be an important reform?
Sure, happy to, Larry. So qualified immunity is a legal concept and doctrine that shields police officers from liability, civil liability. They effectively can't be sued for even the most egregious conduct. So there have been instances where police officers have committed acts of violence against people, where they have killed people, and the victims of that violence and their families can't even set their foot in the door of a courthouse because the lawsuit will be dismissed before it even is heard on the merits because of this concept of qualified immunity. The justification behind it is, look, we don't want police officers having to second guess themselves as they make split-second decisions. And of course, some of us may believe that to be the case, right? We don't want police officers having to second guess themselves. However, what we've seen, even if it's justified in some form, what we've seen and witnessed over the years is that that concept of qualified immunity has morphed into something that produces tremendously absurd results, where people who are killed by police, in some instances where there may be even some sanctions on that police officer, whether through another system or through internal affairs or something like that, cannot get their day in court because they believe because of qualified immunity. When we think about this in the context of reparations, right? In America, our way of making people whole is through the legal system, right? And of course, we can never truly make anybody whole if they've lost their lives or experienced severe trauma as a result of police violence. But our way of addressing it is through compensation through civil liability, right? It may not be a perfect system, but it's what we have. And what we're telling people is because of qualified immunity, you can't have that. So it's on top of violence, on top of that injustice, we're shutting the door to what's supposed to be a fair system of justice.
Among the other reforms that you proposed, Amol, what would you put, what do you think is the single most important thing? What's the ACLU's highest priority among what you mentioned earlier? And then we'll move to Nafisa and Chris for their suggestions.
So I'm going to give you a very lawyerly answer, which is all of it, right? Like we are fighting for this package of reforms that we've been fighting for decades, right? It makes no sense for us, Larry, you've been on the front lines of this fight, to not have civilian oversight over policing, right? And that's because we are hamstrung by state legislation or a lack of state legislation that allows for full-throated civilian complaint review boards, which would allow for somewhere outside of internal affairs that people can go to report complaints of policing. And then there's what I mentioned earlier in my remarks, transparency in policing. We're behind 29 other states that allow for police disciplinary history to be disclosed. So, there's no real, there can't be trust in policing if we don't know what it is that they are up to, and what kinds of misconduct they engage in, and what sorts of discipline they may be facing when they do engage in misconduct. So police officers have to earn our trust. But more broadly speaking, and I think my colleagues on the panel have alluded to this, and I mentioned this, I think we need to shy away from policing. We need to move away from that instinct that we have that police are the answer to every societal discomfort. And I think, as a bigger picture issue, we need to think about alternative responses to societal discomforts than police.
Nafisa, let me go to you next. What would be your, let's say, top three, if you can get to it, priorities in terms of specific concrete reforms that you think would change New Jersey society in terms of its criminal justice system, and address the racism in that system. I think you're.
That's,
there we go.
yeah. I needed that moment. And I totally agree with Amol. And so that would be all of them, right? We know that there are no perfect policies because it's people who write the policies, and there are no perfect people. No policy is going to make everyone happy. And so policies are reflective of the values of the people and what we believe in. And so just off the top of my head, the one that really stands out to me, it would be the Isolated Confinement Restriction Act, also known as the ICRA, which became law in August of 2020. And so for me, it would be that, because what we're talking about is isolated confinement, also once known as administrative segregation. And so even though it was a fight, coalitions, formed and, fought with the ACLU, and, we had survivors of isolated confinement who actually went on like a storytelling roadshow to teach people about the experience, because prior to that, and that's what's really important about policy, it has to have heart. There has to be a heartbeat there. And if there is no heart, nothing is going to live, nothing's going to survive. And so it was a fight to get it signed, because initially we had Governor Christie who said absolutely not, there's no such thing as, isolated confinement in the state, as administrative segregation. Those things don't exist, solitary confinement, no. But we live and we learn and we evaluate and we analyze and we say we have to breathe, some spirit into this policy. And so the breath was the stories of the individuals who lived it. And so that's what pushed it. And so Phil Murphy, he came through for us. But what is it worth when it's not being implemented? It's not being implemented. There are new ways, just like we have new racism and we have new ways of still acting out our past slave history in our present and modern day time. We can see that in the shackles that we put on individuals who are in the system, that it's the same thing. We just rename things. And so the renaming here is the restrictive housing unit. It is still the same practice as isolated confinement. And so for me, I would say when we talk about those conditions, it is a human rights violation to treat individuals like this. And so I say that it is a human responsibility to make sure that policies such as this are enforced and they do follow through, because one thing about this nation, we don't do what's in black and white.
Incredibly powerful. Chris, you write about policing and you write about juvenile justice, a passion of mine as well. Tell us what you think and it doesn't have to be in those areas, what you think the really most critical reforms are that we in New Jersey should take off and enact and work on right now. And as Nafisa says, make sure they're implemented too.
That's right. Meaningfully implemented, right? Fully funded and meaningfully implemented, every remedy and recommendation. So my top three is, number one, we have to radically reduce the footprint of police officers in the lives of all children, and especially Black and Brown children who have been so disproportionately targeted. And so how do we do that? That looks like decriminalizing normal adolescent behaviors. As a matter of statutory reform, it means, making sure the criminal laws are not being used inappropriately on children, like disorderly conduct, disturbing schools, literally doing a comprehensive review of the statute and indicating those offenses for which it is not appropriate in the traditional sense to use to criminalize or to arrest and prosecute Black and brown youth. I think the prosecutors can do that even without statutory reform. Prosecutors are the gatekeepers of juvenile court jurisdiction, making a commitment not to prosecute normal adolescent behaviors. The major reform in that area of radically reducing the footprint of police in the lives of children has to be a police-free schools movement, right? It has to be, and that it is not as radical as it sounds, right? We will always have police available at a 911 call in the case of emergency. What we're talking about is what Amol said earlier, not using police officers to do things we do not need them to do. We do not need police officers to raise adolescents. We cannot police our way out of adolescent development. So that's one. We've got to shrink the size of juvenile courts, okay, by like 80%. And that we focus our law enforcement attention on those final remaining 20% of children who need the most serious intervention. But we really have to shrink the size of the court. And for those rare cases in which we do need police engagement with young people, we have to have a comprehensive set of regulations, accountability that ensure that policing is developmentally appropriate, right? That means training officers in adolescent development, de-escalation strategies. It means a comprehensive set of regulations that prohibit the use of force on children. And guess what? Going back to what Nafisa said, use of force involves handcuffing. Why are we handcuffing, for example, children under the age of 12? You know, why are we body slamming children in the mall and putting them in handcuffs when all you have to do, if your own children were in a fight, you would pull them apart, right? You know, we wouldn't take this aggressive stance. That implicit bias is real that Amol talked about. And then the final piece is for that small 20% of the children maybe that should be left in potentially in the juvenile legal system or in the criminal system. We need to remember they are still children. They don't become adults the day that we arrest them, okay? And so that means we have to treat them like children. We don't send them to adult court. We don't give them lengthy draconian sentences like life without parole. We don't put them in solitary confinement. We don't co-locate them with adults and subject them to physical and emotional abuse. So those are my three broad categories.
It's incredibly helpful. I get questions. I can see questions that you panelists can't see. And so Nafisa, I have one follow-up for you, which is, can you tell us what ways the Isolated Confinement Act are not being implemented the way you think they should, and what should we do about that? Just very concretely. We only have a couple minutes before we have to go to audience questions, so if you could.
Okay, so I'll do my best to go through this one, right? Mm-hmm. So individuals are said to be out of their cells for, a mandatory 4 hours out of the day, right? So that includes, any phone calls, showers, recreation time, any kind of programming should be happening during those hours, much of which it does not happen. And so that could be of many factors, right? It is a prison. Things do happen, right? There could be some sort of an emergency in which the prison has to be shut down during those hours, so no one can come out. And so you miss that opportunity that day. But the following day, it should be, back to business as usual. But, if you have a unit officer who is not in the mood to let you out, or they're retaliating against you because you have gone through the grievance process, and so they know that you have reported some sort of, injustice, right? And so there are many ways in which people are not getting the amount of time that they should have out. The other thing is the length of time that individuals are kept back there. They're not supposed to be there longer than 15 days, but they have figured out a way in which they can continue adding extra time onto the amount of time that someone does. So they could do 15 days, and before their 15 days is up, they can get another infraction, also known as a charge, and have that amount of time once again reset to another 15 days. So we're going beyond what the regulations said. And also there are individuals who are mentally ill who are being kept in the RHU, and they're not supposed to be, as well as people who have chronic health issues are also there. So there's, I mean, I can go on because this is a list of things that are not being implemented, and it's easy to ignore a thing when you don't have an ombudsman and people like that in place who are supposed to see to it that the conditions and once again, these policies are implemented.
Thank you. Thank you all for fantastic answers. I have a lot of amazingly great questions from the audience. I'm going to start to ask them, but just for audience members who have sent in questions, if your question isn't asked, you please understand there are just tons of them. So let me start with this one. During the State of the Union message, the president talked about not defunding police, but in fact, funding police more. Amal, what's your reaction to that? And what's your view about the sort of defund police movement in general, as it fits within this, view that we're taking towards racism and criminal justice?
So I think the president's message was harmful. I think that's a real problem that he leaned into funding the police, and clearly it was a response to the defund the police movement. What people don't understand or willfully are ignorant to is that the defund the police movement is about reinvesting money into community-based responses and making sure that we are thinking about a whole person and not just an armed response whenever there's a discomfort or a problem. Honestly, if we're talking about funding the police, there's no community that has defunded the police in the United States. Nobody has done that. And in fact, many police departments have increased funding in the past 2 years. Certainly in New Jersey, we've seen increases in funding on the municipal level across over the past couple of years. So this is policing at its most funded, and we see how broken it is. And we see that if you see how certain crimes categories are going up, it's policing fully resourced that's allowing that to happen. So clearly we need to rethink this. I was talking to a friend who works in a city council, and he was telling me that their city will touch any budget except for policing. They will move $1 from anything to anything else, but they will not touch the policing budget because it is so toxic to be in that space to tell police that they're going to be cutting their budgets even the slightest bit. And so I think what we have seen is the rhetoric around defunding the police has solicited this backlash that's been totally unjustified. It's the all lives matter sort of response to scrutinizing budgets, which we should be doing as a matter of fiscal responsibility, putting aside what you might think about racial justice and everything else that we're talking about here. If you care about fiscal responsibility, you should care about scrutinizing police budgets, because we don't know what's happening behind the scenes when those dollars are spent.
Chris, one of the suggestions that one of our audience members asks this question: do you feel that the addition of social services in communities working side by side with police could help avoid unnecessary introduction of police into every situation? And I think along those lines about your particular interest, which is police treatment of juveniles. And that must be, I would think, a place where there's a lot of police working side by side with social services. How does that work? And what's your response to that very good question?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's such a great question, and it's a nuanced question, right? Because in my mind, I always have to default back to, let's not send police officers in the first place to respond to, as Amol calls it, I like that, discomfort, or mental illness, drug addictions, adolescent behaviors. So that's the first, I just want to start there. That said, this notion of sending out social services alongside of police, as an intermediate until we get to a place in our country where we can relinquish our over-reliance on police, I do think it is at least educational for police officers, right? So if there is a call to 911 about a disturbance, maybe involving someone who appears to be intoxicated or drug addicted in some way, sending a drug addictions counselor there. Or if someone seems to be having a mental health crisis, sending a mental health specialist with the police officer. But I hope it's doing what it's supposed to do, which is to educate police officers that actually we can do better, that they aren't needed for every situation. So if we could have both a 311 and a 911, right? We all as a society learn to call 311 for that drug addiction or for that mental health crisis, we would all be better off. So I don't want to say no to those creative ideas, right? I'm in favor of, mobile mental health units or mobile crisis units for mental health, but let's send them alone as soon as we can. And then, if they need to triage, right? They get to the scene, they assess the scene, and then they determine that a police officer is needed, then maybe, right? And so I just want us to think in layers about those types of reforms.
Nafisa, you've talked about isolated confinement. And from your own experience, before you even get to the sort of conditions of confinement, what about sentencing? What's your view of we have a lot of questions up here about mandatory minimum sentencing and what the effect of mandatory minimum sentencing is to people who are in custody. And what's your perspective on the harm that may be caused by mandatory minimum sentencing?
Great question. Well, first and foremost, sentencing alone, there is a problem there, because sentencing does not mean treatment. Sentencing means we are going to throw you away for a set period of time. And if you have a mandatory minimum, you will have to go up before parole, and you do have to possibly deal with parole denying you the chance to come home and giving you more time to serve until they feel as though you are fit to come back into society. That is extremely disturbing. I would say the same about the No Early Release Act, also known as the 85% law, where you have individuals who are serving 85% of their sentence, and then they have to do a mandatory 3 to 5 years on parole. That's additional supervision. That's just like, you have this threat of being returned back to prison throughout that time. You have all of these different barriers that are put in place while you're on parole, because if you're someone who's you're out there, you're working, you could be doing advocacy work, and you need to go to another state. And if your parole officer does not want you to go, they can make sure that you don't get a travel pass to go. There are a lot of things that can hinder an individual from being able to really be productive. The issue with mandatory minimums is the fact that it's just another way to keep making money off of Black and brown bodies. If you want to know what these issues are, you have to do what a very good friend of mine, Cookie Rivera, says, and that is follow the money. So the mandatory minimums makes money, and I'm totally against that, because that's when we talk about things like recidivism, people going back into the system. So as long as you have mandatory minimums and you have societies, you have people of color, it's something that's not spoken of enough is that when, mandatory minimums was being spoken about, it was people of color who really bought into it. So we bought into, and many people talk about how Black people sold one another into slavery. Well, we did it again, with mandatory minimums. And so this is another conversation when you really have to be honest. So just as we're going to talk about white supremacist systems, we have to talk about how these systems can cause us to become divided. And so it is that Black community that bought into it who's being ravaged by it. So if we want to talk about, what that issue is, it's the fact of how much money we're making off of mandatory minimums in those Black bodies.
Some people justify mandatory minimums by saying that they're helpful to public safety. You've spoken a lot today about police. Is it your perspective that we don't need police to enforce safety in our communities? What's your view of the proper role that police play in our society today?
My perspective is that we don't need police for everything. We don't need police for every single thing that we call police for right now. And as somebody who, there may be folks in the audience that may have family members who are police officers. That police officers have way too much on their plates. That we're asking them to be drug counselors, to be therapists, to be child counselors. We're asking them to be people that can resolve, domestic violence issues. But clearly, we're asking them to do too much, right? And we need to reimagine what it is that we are asking them to do. I get to do some hiring at the ACLU of New Jersey, and when I put together a job posting, I think about how to fill up 75% of that person's plate so that the other 25% can be there for surprises or emerging things or things like that. What we're asking for police officers is 150% at all times, and we are able to continue to fund that without giving them the adequate tools to be able to handle all of those sorts of things. And I think that's a real problem. What we really need is alternative responses, right? So it may not be a police officer that comes in to help you when your car breaks down. It may just be a tow truck. It may not be a police officer that comes when there's an emotionally disturbed person or somebody who needs some mental health care, but rather a social worker or a counselor of some sort. So there is a narrowing that we have to do as a society to stop thinking about police as the first response. And that's not necessarily eliminating police. I don't know where I am on that yet. However, I do think that there is a need to reassess whether or not policing is the right response to everything.
Chris, one of the solutions that's been proposed and actually implemented in other states, but not here in New Jersey, is the idea of licensing or certifications for police. We've rejected that here. I suspect just because you know everything about policing that you've looked into that some. But do you have a perspective on whether we should have, and particularly in terms of police who deal with juveniles, as you've studied, whether they should have particular qualifications or be certified in a way that will make them better able to do their jobs and do it in a way that it is not so infected by either explicit or implicit bias?
Right. So think about it. Would you go to a heart doctor to get your leg, surgery on your leg? No. Would you go to an eye doctor if your kidney, was ruptured? No. So we need police officers who are specially trained, licensed, regulated, held accountable for what we need them to do. And you notice specialty, expertise, right? And so particularly when it comes to young people, we've already talked about how incredibly important it is to engage with young people in developmentally appropriate ways. There are police officers, and I do not say this about all police officers, but there are police officers who get assigned to schools who don't like children. I'm sorry, that should be number one. How about you like the kids, right? Those are some of the basics, right? But adolescent development, we know more about the adolescent brain and the key features of adolescence than we ever have. And so every single police officer who has any contact with young people should learn those basic fundamental aspects of adolescence. But this notion of licensing, right? That we have a body of officers who are uniquely trained to engage with young people in those rare circumstances when that engagement is necessary, right? So I do think there is extraordinary value. We expect it in every other aspect of life. We expect it for teachers, right? We expect it in every other professional realm. So why wouldn't we expect that of police officers? And, part of why it's so difficult to hold officers accountable, right? You talk about qualified immunity and the like, it's because we can always say, well, they were never on notice that this is what they needed to do. And this is how they needed to treat people. So licensing helps us get through that, right? Setting minimum standards of engagement, and especially with young people. So if we were going to start reform incrementally, I would love a wholesale reform, but at least, have licensure for police officers who engage with young people. And it makes us as a society really put on paper, what is minimally relevant by way of knowledge, by way of requirements, by way of, responsibility for young people. And so I'm in favor, so.
Can I just add a real quick note on that, Larry? So, there are several professions in New Jersey that are licensed, right? Like if you are a manicurist or a hairstylist or a plumber, of course, a lawyer, whatever. There are websites to go to determine whether or not your manicurist or your hairstylist or your plumber has disciplinary dings on their record, right? Like whether they've engaged in any degree of misconduct. But we don't have that for police. We don't have anywhere to go to learn about police misconduct. And even the most recent, what I would consider wins from the Attorney General's office, allowing for some disclosure of disciplinary history, falls short, because what we see there is they gave very broad examples of why it is that a police officer may be disciplined. And it could include things like somebody, recklessly drove their car, their police cruiser, but it would be categorized as a policy violation, right? Like, so you don't exactly know the details of what it is that police officers are engaging in and whether or not you should trust them to feel safe. Yet we have that information for other professions, and we can better hold those other professions accountable. Meanwhile, police officers are the ones that carry guns and can injure or kill people.
So I want to ask each of you kind of a final question. We only have a few more minutes. But in some ways, it's the most important question. And it's a question that comes from our audience. Before I get there, let me just say this is already on your in the chat. But if for people who haven't seen it, everybody who's watching this will get an email with a recording of today's proceedings. So we're getting a few questions about that. So don't worry, you'll get a recording of it. So here's a specific audience question I'm going to read for you. I'm an activist and advocate based in the city of Tampa. To say that we have a problem with our criminal justice system would be an understatement, to say the least. What can an activist like myself do other than create awareness around the issue or go to law school after I finish college? Hopefully transferring to Princeton in the fall, he says. But let me just, but beyond those who are activists already, I think the question I really want to end with for each of you today is for the people who are watching this, for the people who will see this recording, what is it that they should do to begin to address this extraordinary injustice that is the racism of our criminal justice system? Nafisa, let me start with you. You are an activist, so you can maybe address it from that perspective first. But let's just get a few minutes from each of you on what our audience members specifically should be doing to make this world a better place in this regard.
Simply, you have to build power around the issues. There are many problems, with the system, but we have to be able to find the issues. And to be honest, the winnable issues, get them out the way first, right? When we look at this system, this is a behemoth. This is beyond that. This is a Leviathan. This thing is huge, okay? So we're never going to just blow it up, right? We have to be able to chip away at it. And so any win in decreasing the size of this monster is necessary. It's vital, right? But what I would say is, you have to, if you feel passionate about it, if it's in your being to do something about it, then start talking to the people around you and find out how they feel about it. And you all need to come together, and then you organize and you mobilize around those issues. It's exhausting. It's exhausting, but the reward is, you can't even describe it. But then you're left with the feeling of, there's still so much work to do. So don't put the weight of the world on your shoulders. That's what everyone else is here to help you do. And that's the whole thing's up. But I definitely say you have to first start with building power. And so that's in building relationships.
Chris, you represent individuals, you teach. What is it that you think that our audience members should do to begin to address this incredibly daunting problem? Because as Nafisa says, it's just so huge.
Yeah, Nafisa's comments were just spot on. I mean, my first thing that I thought of was youth voices, right? Getting young people at the table to talk about these issues. I am blown away when I get into space and get into community with young people. Literally, they are brilliant, they are thoughtful, they are observant about what's going on around them. So we've been talking, for example, about police in schools, and they are far more nuanced about this conversation than, black and white, defund the police, abolition. It's like, hey, look, they tell you what they need. We need more counselors. I had a beautiful conversation with a young girl last weekend, and we were talking about how she felt about police in schools. And she said to me, social emotional learning, that's one of the best practices, right? This public health approach to public safety. So she says, we have social emotional learning at our school, and I think it's good, but we need to tweak it a little bit. I was like, oh, really? Say more, tweak it. She was like, one, we need to have that conversation about social emotional learning at a different time during the day when students are paying more attention. And then she also said to me, and social emotional learning, our class, it needs to be more interactive. They can't just lecture at us. And I was this is so beautiful. If we could create space for young people to come and to offer ideas and solutions about the issues. And so the question itself, talked about educating oneself. I don't want to take it for granted. That's a huge piece. You got to educate yourselves on the issue, right? And you educate yourselves on the issue by hearing from, engaging with the folks who are most impacted. It is the narratives, it is the stories that change hearts and minds, right? And then you tell those stories before lawmakers and legislative officials, and that's how we bring about change. And it is, I agree, Nafisa, it is so daunting at times. And so I say to folks, look, you can only do one thing. Often you can only do one thing at a time. Pick your one issue, find that one thing you're passionate about, and run with that. Right? And don't expect that you can do everything. Yes, there'll be advocates like Nafisa, Amol, and Larry who'll take it all on, but you as an individual, you can do one thing. And so find your one issue.
Spectacular. Amol, what we've heard about is building power. What we've heard about is listening to affected people. You and I are lucky because as lawyers, we can wake up in the morning and say, today we're going to change the world. We're going to go in front of a judge and get that judge to rule for us and change things. Yesterday, the Supreme Court ruled in a case that there's a public right of access to certain police disciplinary information. That was a win for the ACLU. That happens because, courageous advocates like you and people who work with you get up in court and make those arguments. But for the people who are listening here today, what should they do beyond building power, beyond listening to affected people? Obviously, fantastic suggestions. What's your perspective on that? And we'll finish with that.
Sure. So I want to end on a note of hope, which is that we talked about the problem. We talked about some proposed solutions. What I think we should reflect on is a little bit of the successes, right? Like, we have been able to do good things in New Jersey and meaningfully disrupt the criminal legal system, including, and this echoes building power. We got lawmakers to pass a bill that reduced our incarceration, prison population by 42%. Right, we were able to reduce our prison population so significantly just over the past 2 years, where we had come together with directly impacted people, including folks at Nafisa's organization and New Jersey Prison Justice Watch and Salvation and Social Justice, and family members of people who had lost loved ones who were inside, and told lawmakers those stories and got them to, made it politically impossible for them not to listen to those stories and act on them, and got them to pass a piece of legislation that released people early who are nearing the ends of their sentences. And when all is said and done, we'll have over 8,000 people released from New Jersey prisons and jails. And so that's one success. And it was because of the connective tissue between all of our organizations, the ability to work with impacted people and make sure that we are sharing their stories and putting them front and center. The other thing is ensuring that you're engaging with organizations that are already doing the work. I would be remiss if I didn't say that you should join your local ACLU affiliate, become a member, work with the NAACP in your state, work with the other organizations that are leading some of the changes in your state and your jurisdiction. In terms of the legal work, I would also say, if there are people that are considering law school or are in law school or are lawyers themselves, there are plenty of opportunities to do meaningful public interest oriented work. Larry, you're a great example. You work at a major law firm, yet you are leading some of the most cutting edge constitutional law cases in the state of New Jersey and beyond. So there are huge opportunities for people to get involved every step of the way. I'll just note that we had a few major successes, including the public access case that you mentioned. We were able to get a settlement with partners at law firms and at other organizations on accessing special education for people who were incarcerated who were denied. That was a 5-year-long lawsuit that we were able to settle just the other week. We were able, Larry, with partnership with you and Gibbons, we were able to get an end to extreme sentences for juveniles. We were able to get that, and that was 10 years of a litigation battle. So to Nafisa's point, incremental change is change, right? Like, we're getting there step by step, and incremental change is the building blocks for transformational change. So I would say, listen to Nafisa and Chris Henning, and also read Chris Henning's book, which I have right here. So make sure that you pick that up, and also don't get discouraged, because I think the winds change over time, political, legal, otherwise, and even if it feels uphill, there are people out there and forces out there that are working towards that change, and it's the on-the-ground organizers and activists and directly impacted people that make all the difference.
So with that incredibly inspiring speech, really, we're going to wrap up. Let me just say that for all the people who are watching, what you've seen on this panel are people who are not only brilliant and articulate, but also, in many ways more important, passionate and tenacious. That's what we need to be if we're going to confront this problem. It's a problem that will persist, but that we can fight every step of the way if we employ our creativity, our tenacity, our brilliance, and mostly our passion and compassion for people who are involved. We need to listen and act. And I can't tell you how inspired I come away from listening to Nafisa and Chris and Emil. These are spectacular people and wonderful leaders. And I hope you've all enjoyed it and learned as much from it as I have. I'm so grateful. So let me, with that, turn it back to, I think it's Kiki who gets it next.
Thank you very much, Larry. This has been a really wonderful, motivating, and inspiring and challenging conversation. I liked Amal's advice to not get discouraged and just keep going. Our moderator, Larry Lusberg, and our panelists, Amal Sinha, Professor Kristen Henning, and Nafisa Goldsmith were just wonderful. I'd like also to recognize all of our partners and co-sponsors without whom this event would not be possible. I hope that you enjoyed the conversation and are inspired to get involved. By Monday, each of you will receive an email with resources and information to help you drive change in your community. It also will include a recording of this event, so you can refer to it. Additionally, we hope you'll join us by participating in the next installment of Imagine More, Racial Justice Begins With Us, which takes place on April 26th, when we'll be talking about achieving safe and healthy homes for all. More information can be found at www.imaginemorenj.org. And if you missed our launch event, Eliminating the Racial Wealth Gap and Ending Poverty, you can also view a recording of that on the website. Thank you for joining us tonight. Have a great evening.